What happened when you finally stood up to your toxic MIL? The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I watched Linda blow out the candles on her 65th birthday cake, her saccharine smile beaming at the 23 family members gathered in her pristine dining room. Everyone was clapping and cheering, completely oblivious to the fact that I was about to detonate a 3-year stockpile of evidence that would expose exactly who this woman really was. My phone buzzed in my purse, another notification from the voice recording app that had been running for the past hour, capturing every fake laugh and backhanded compliment Linda had thrown my way tonight. Just like she'd done every family gathering since I married her son David. "Sarah, honey, could you help me clear these plates?" Linda's voice carried that familiar edge of false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I know you're not used to hosting parties this size, but I thought you might want to learn." There it was. The first dig of the evening, delivered with a smile in front of David's Aunt Margaret and Uncle Tom, who were visiting from Oregon. 3 years ago, I would have swallowed the humiliation and shuffled to the kitchen like a scolded child. 6 months ago, I might have muttered something under my breath and complied. But tonight was different. Tonight, I had screenshots of 47 text messages Linda had sent to David over the past year, each one more venomous than the last. Messages calling me lazy for staying home with Emma, manipulative for asking David to spend less time at his mother's house, and unfit for letting our 4-year-old daughter watch cartoons on weekdays. Tonight, I had a 12-minute recording from last month's barbecue where Linda told her sister Carol that I was probably cheating because I'd started going to yoga classes twice a week. Most importantly, tonight I had the memory of last Sunday burned into my brain, the moment Linda crossed a line so unforgivable that it shattered whatever remained of my resolve to keep the peace for the sake of family harmony. "Mommy doesn't really love Daddy," she had whispered to Emma while I was in the bathroom during our weekly visit. "That's why Mommy is always so mean to Grandma." I'd heard every word through the thin bathroom door, my heart stopping as my daughter's confused little voice asked, "But why doesn't Mommy love Daddy?" Linda's response still echoed in my nightmares, "Some mommies just pretend to love their families, sweetheart. But don't worry, Grandma will always protect Daddy and you." David had dismissed it when I confronted him that night, just like he'd dismissed everything else for 3 years. "Mom would never say that," he'd insisted, not even bothering to look up from his laptop. "You're being paranoid again. Can't you just try to get along with her for Emma's sake?" For Emma's sake. The phrase that had kept me silent through Linda's campaign of psychological warfare, through her attempts to turn my own daughter against me, through her systematic destruction of my self-worth. Well, tonight Emma was safely at my sister's house for a sleepover, and I was done protecting everyone's feelings except my own. I set down my champagne and smiled back at Linda, my hand sliding into my purse to touch the manila envelope containing printed screenshots, transcripts, and a detailed timeline of every incident over the past 3 years. "Actually, Linda," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room, "I think it's time we all learned something new tonight." The silence that followed my words stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Linda's perfectly applied lipstick curved into what I'd learned to recognize as her concerned mother-in-law expression, the one she used right before delivering her most devastating blows. "Oh, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy, "you look so tired lately. David mentioned you haven't been sleeping well. Maybe you should sit down and have some cake instead of." "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through her performance like a knife. Every conversation in the room stopped. Uncle Tom's fork paused halfway to his mouth. David's cousin Jennifer actually turned around from where she'd been loading the dishwasher. David appeared at my elbow so quickly I wondered if he'd been hovering nearby, waiting for me to embarrass the family again. "Sarah, what's going on? You're making everyone uncomfortable." I almost laughed. After 3 years of Linda making me uncomfortable, making me question my own reality, my own worth as a mother and wife, now suddenly everyone cared about discomfort. Am I, David? Making people uncomfortable? I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshots folder I'd organized last week. "Because I think your family deserves to know exactly what Linda really thinks about all of them." Linda's face went white beneath her foundation. "Sarah, I don't know what you think you're doing, but..." August 15th, I read from my phone, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Text from Linda to David, "Your wife is turning into a complete slob. Carol mentioned Sarah was in pajama pants at the grocery store yesterday. How embarrassing for our family name." David's Aunt Carol choked on her wine. "Linda, you said that about Sarah?" September 22nd, I continued, warming up now. Quote, "I'm worried Emma is going to grow up with no discipline. Sarah lets that child eat goldfish crackers for breakfast and watch TV past 8 p.m. We need to discuss custody arrangements before it's too late." "Custody arrangements?" David's voice cracked on the words. This was news to him too, apparently. Linda had been planting seeds about taking our daughter away and hadn't even bothered to include her own son in the conversation. Linda was frantically shaking her head, her silver hair coming loose from its perfect updo. Those messages were taken out of context. I was just concerned about. October 7th, I steamrolled over her protests, Linda to her sister Joyce, "I honestly think Sarah might be mentally unstable. She's paranoid, antisocial, and yesterday she accused me of trying to undermine her parenting. David would be so much better off without her dragging him down." Aunt Joyce's face went crimson. She was sitting right there at the dining table, having arrived from Phoenix just this morning for Linda's birthday celebration. "Linda, you told me Sarah was struggling with postpartum depression and that you were trying to help her get professional support." "That's not what you said behind closed doors," I said, scrolling to the next screenshot. "You told Joyce that I was probably having an affair because I started going to yoga classes. You suggested David should hire a private investigator to follow me." The room erupted. David's father Robert, who'd been silent in his corner armchair, suddenly slammed his beer bottle down on the side table. "Linda, what the hell is wrong with you?" But I wasn't done. Not even close. "And David," I said, turning to face my husband whose face had gone gray, "you want to know why I haven't been sleeping well? It's because your mother told our 4-year-old daughter that Mommy doesn't really love Daddy." The gasp that went up from the room was audible. "She said what?" David's voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of Linda's dining room, everyone heard it. Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's not, I never, Sarah, you're twisting my words again." "Am I?" I pulled up the voice memo app on my phone, the one I'd been running during our visit last Sunday. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear anymore. From pure, unleashed fury. Because I had it recorded, Linda. The color drained completely from Linda's face. David stumbled backward like I'd physically struck him. You recorded my mother? His voice cracked with disbelief, but I couldn't tell if he was angry at me or finally starting to understand what I'd been trying to tell him for 3 years. I recorded the conversation where she told our daughter that some mommies just pretend to love their families. I looked around the room at 23 faces staring back at me, some shocked, some horrified, and a few nodding like pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. Emma asked her why mommy doesn't love daddy, and your mother said, but don't worry, sweetheart. Grandma will always protect daddy and you. David's cousin Jennifer stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. Linda, please tell me Sarah's lying. Of course she's lying. Linda's voice pitched higher, that syrupy sweetness replaced by something raw and desperate. This girl has been trying to turn my son against me since the day they got married. She's manipulative and jealous and... October 23rd, I read from my phone again, cutting her off. Linda to David, Jennifer mentioned a book club that Sarah seems withdrawn lately. I told her it's probably because Sarah knows she's not good enough for our family. Some women just can't handle being married above their station. Jennifer's jaw dropped. You said Sarah was dealing with seasonal depression and that I should invite her to more family events to help her feel included. November 4th, I continued, my voice getting stronger with each revelation. Text to David, Robert thinks I'm being too hard on Sarah, but he doesn't see how she manipulates you. Yesterday she actually had the nerve to ask me to call before coming over. Like I need permission to visit my own son in the house we helped you buy. David's father Robert stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Linda, we talked about boundaries. I specifically told you to respect Sarah's request about calling first. November 18th, I pressed on, Linda to her neighbor Mrs. Patterson, I'm documenting everything Sarah does wrong as a mother. David doesn't see it yet, but Emma would be better off with just him and me raising her. Some women just aren't cut out for motherhood. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Patterson, Linda's neighbor of 15 years who'd been invited to the birthday celebration, looked mortified. Linda, you told me you were keeping notes to help Sarah improve her confidence as a new mother. December 2nd, my voice was steady now, reading from the transcript I'd typed up after listening to Linda's phone call 3 times to make sure I had every word right. Linda to her sister Joyce, I'd been leaving parenting books around their house with specific chapters bookmarked. Sarah's too stupid to take the hint, but maybe David will eventually realize he married beneath him. David made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. And my personal favorite, I said, scrolling to the final screenshot. December 15th, just last week. Linda to David, Sarah's sister called looking for her yesterday when Sarah didn't show up for lunch. I told her Sarah's been flaky and unreliable lately. I didn't mention that Sarah was at the pediatrician with Emma for her checkup, because honestly, David, your wife needs to learn that actions have consequences. The room exploded into chaos. You sabotaged Sarah's relationship with her own sister? David's voice was barely recognizable, low, and dangerous in a way I'd never heard before. Jenny called me crying that night because she thought Sarah was avoiding her family. Linda was backing toward the kitchen now, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the doorframe. David, sweetheart, you have to understand, I was trying to protect you from... From what exactly, Mom? Jennifer stepped between Linda and her escape route. From Sarah being a good mother? Because I've watched her with Emma at every family gathering for 3 years, and that little girl adores her. This is all taken out of context. Linda's voice was shrill now, the mask completely slipping. Sarah has been poisoning you all against me. She's been planning this attack for months, collecting private conversations. Private conversations about my wife and daughter, David interrupted, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. Private conversations where you called my wife mentally unstable, unfit as a mother, and suggested I should investigate her for cheating. Robert slammed his hand against the mantel, making Linda's collection of family photos rattle. 47 years of marriage, Linda, and I never knew you were capable of this level of cruelty. Cruelty? Linda's laugh was bitter and sharp. I'm the only one in this family with a backbone to say what everyone else is thinking. Sarah trapped David with that pregnancy. Emma wasn't planned, but she wasn't a trap, I said quietly, but my words cut through Linda's rant like ice water. And the fact that you've been holding that against me for 4 years explains a lot. Uncle Tom, who'd been silent since this all started, slowly set down his dessert plate. Linda, when you invited us here from Oregon, you spent 20 minutes on the phone telling us how worried you were about David's marriage. You said Sarah was struggling and that you'd been trying to support her through a difficult time. I was supporting. You told my 4-year-old daughter that I don't love her father, I said, my voice cutting through her protests. You looked at my child and tried to make her believe her family was broken. David's cousin Mark, who'd been scrolling through his phone in the corner, suddenly looked up. Linda, did you tell Mom that Sarah was spreading rumors about you at Emma's preschool? My blood ran cold. What? Mark looked between me and Linda, his confusion obvious. Aunt Linda called Mom last week and said you'd been telling Emma's teachers that Grandma Linda was difficult and asking them to limit her pickup privileges. I never said anything to Emma's teachers about Linda, I said, my voice hollow with the realization of how deep this went. I've never restricted her access to Emma at all. David turned to face his mother, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw him really see her. Mom, did you lie to the family about Sarah trying to keep Emma away from you? Linda's silence was answer enough. Jesus Christ, David whispered. How long have you been doing this? How many lies have you told about my wife? Everything I did was to protect this family. Linda exploded, her composure finally shattering completely. Sarah has been trying to isolate you from us since day one. She doesn't come to family dinners, she doesn't participate in holidays the way we've always done them, she doesn't respect our traditions. Because you made it clear from day one that I wasn't welcome, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. The first Christmas after David and I got engaged, you seated me at the kids' table while your neighbor Mrs. Patterson got my spot with the adults. Mrs. Patterson's face went scarlet. Linda, you told me that was Sarah's preference because she was shy around the family. The lies were unraveling faster than Linda could keep track of them, 3 years of careful manipulation exposed in real time. You want to know what really happened that first Christmas? I pulled out another screenshot, one I'd been saving. Linda texted David's ex-girlfriend Rebecca 3 days before the party. The room went dead silent. David's face turned ashen. What are you talking about? December 22nd, 3 years ago. Linda to Rebecca Chan, David seems miserable with this new girl. Maybe you should stop by Christmas Eve, just to say hello to the family. He always lights up when he sees you. Jennifer gasped. Mom, you invited Rebecca to David's first Christmas with Sarah? Rebecca just happened to show up, Linda said weakly, but her voice lacked conviction now. With homemade cookies and a present for David, I continued, reading from my phone. And when I asked you privately if you knew she was coming, you told me Rebecca was practically family and that I needed to accept that David had a history with people who mattered to you. David was staring at his mother like he'd never seen her before. Mom, I asked you point blank if you'd invited Rebecca. You swore to me she just dropped by. And here's the follow-up text, I said, scrolling down. Linda to Rebecca, December 26th, thanks for coming by yesterday. Did you see how uncomfortable Sarah looked? I think David is starting to realize what a mistake he made. Uncle Tom stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Linda, that's enough. This is sick. But Linda wasn't done fighting. You all act like Sarah is some innocent victim, but you don't see what I see. Last month she deliberately scheduled Emma's dance recital on my book club day. Emma's recital was scheduled by the dance studio in August, I interrupted. It's always the third Saturday of December. Your book club meets the third Saturday of every month. I didn't control the calendar, Linda. And she's been filling Emma's head with ideas about cutting her hair short because she knows I love Emma's curls. Emma asked for a haircut because 3 kids at preschool told her she looked like a girl in her Halloween costume when she dressed as a pirate, David said quietly. Sarah told me that night. She asked my opinion about whether Emma was too young to make that choice. Robert shook his head slowly. Linda, you're grasping at straws now. Am I? Linda's voice turned vicious, all pretense of the sweet grandmother act abandoned. Ask her why she really started those yoga classes twice a week. Ask her why she needs 2 hours away from her family every Tuesday and Thursday evening. David looked at me, and I could see the tiny seed of doubt Linda was trying to plant, even now. Even after everything. Because your mother told me I was getting fat, I said simply. March 15th. Linda to David, Sarah's really let herself go since Emma was born. Maybe suggested gym membership for her birthday? I'm embarrassed to introduce her as my daughter-in-law at church. The hurt that flashed across David's face was devastating. She never told me she said that to you. Because I knew you'd make excuses for her, just like you always do, I said, my voice cracking slightly. So I started yoga classes to lose weight and get stronger. The instructor, Maria, is 63 years old and has been married for 40 years. Hardly a fair material. Jennifer was openly crying now. Sarah, I am so sorry. We had no idea she was doing this to you. But you did know, I said, looking around the room at faces that were finally showing recognition instead of confusion. You all knew I was struggling. You knew I stopped coming to family events. You knew I seemed withdrawn and anxious. But instead of asking me what was wrong, you let Linda explain it away. Mark shifted uncomfortably. She said you were dealing with adjustment issues. New mom stress. Adjustment issues, I repeated. That's what she called it when I had a panic attack at Emma's second birthday party after Linda announced to everyone that she'd bought Emma's big girl bed without asking us first, then told Emma she could sleep at Grandma's house whenever Mommy and Daddy were fighting. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. We weren't even fighting, David whispered. We weren't even fighting, David whispered. But after that party, Emma kept asking if Mommy and Daddy were mad at each other. I thought she was just picking up on normal household stress. She was picking up on Grandma Linda's suggestions, I said, pulling up another voice memo on my phone. This is from Emma's third birthday party, 6 months ago. I was recording Emma opening presents when I caught this conversation between Linda and your Aunt Carol. I hit play, and Linda's voice filled the silent room, poor little Emma. She told me yesterday that Mommy cries in the bathroom sometimes. I think Sarah might need professional help, but David's in denial about how bad things have gotten. Aunt Carol's voice responded, maybe we should stage an intervention? Linda, you know this family better than anyone. I don't cry in the bathroom because I'm mentally unstable, I said, stopping the recording. I cry because your mother spent 3 years convincing everyone around me that I was a failure as a wife and mother, and I had nowhere else to break down. David's hands were shaking now. Mom, please tell me you didn't actually suggest a mental health intervention for my wife. Linda's mouth opened and closed silently. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. Jennifer stepped closer to me, her voice gentle. Sarah, what else did she do? Because I'm starting to remember some conversations that make a lot more sense now. I scrolled through my documented evidence, 3 years of psychological warfare organized by date and severity. She's been intercepting my mail, I said quietly. Birthday cards from my grandmother, letters from my college friends who moved away, even medical appointment reminders. Linda has a key to our house that David gave her for emergencies, but she's been using it to go through our things when we're not home. That's breaking and entering, Uncle Tom said flatly. 2 months ago, I got suspicious because my friend Kate mentioned she'd sent me a care package that never arrived. So I installed a security camera in our entryway. I pulled up the app on my phone, showing the room a crystal clear video of Linda entering our house with her key, sorting through a pile of mail, and slipping several envelopes into her purse. This is from November 20th, a Tuesday when David was at work and Emma and I were at the Children's Museum. David stared at the phone screen like it was showing him footage from another planet. Mom, you stole Sarah's mail? I wasn't stealing, Linda's voice was desperate now, higher pitched than I'd ever heard it. I was protecting David from Sarah's family trying to manipulate her against us. Her mother sends those cards filled with passive-aggressive comments about how we don't visit enough, and her college friends keep inviting her to reunions where she'll reconnect with old boyfriends. My grandmother sends me $20 and a recipe she thinks I'll like, I interrupted. And my college friends are mostly married women with kids who live 3 states away. Robert was staring at his wife like she'd grown a second head. Linda, you've been committing federal crimes. Tampering with mail is a felony. Everything I did was to protect this family. Linda exploded again, but this time her voice cracked on the words. Sarah has been systematically destroying David's relationship with us. Before her, he called me every day. He spent Sundays here. He asked for my advice about important decisions. He still does all of those things, I said wearily. David calls you every morning on his way to work. We spend every Sunday at your house for dinner. Last month, you helped him pick out new tires for his truck. But it's different now, Linda said, and for the first time, her voice sounded small and lost instead of manipulative. He puts you first. When you and I disagree, he takes your side. When you don't want to come to family events, he stays home with you instead of coming anyway. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. David slowly sank into one of Linda's pristine dining room chairs, his head in his hands. Mom, he said quietly, that's what marriage means. Sarah is my wife. She's supposed to come first. But I'm your mother, Linda whispered, and suddenly she looked every one of her 65 years. I raised you. I sacrificed everything for you and your father. I thought when you got married, I'd gain a daughter, not lose my son. Jennifer's voice was gentle but firm. You would have gained a daughter if you treated Sarah like one instead of like a threat. Linda looked around the room at 23 faces staring back at her, some angry, some disappointed, some just sad. The woman who had ruled this family through manipulation and control for decades suddenly looked very small and very alone. I think, said Robert quietly, we need to have a very long conversation about what happens next. The grandfather clock in Linda's hallway chimed 10 o'clock, marking what felt like the longest hour of my life. Robert's words hung in the air, what happens next, and I realized I hadn't actually thought beyond this moment. For weeks, I'd focused entirely on exposing Linda's behavior, but now 23 pairs of eyes were looking between her crumpled form and me, waiting for someone to decide how to pick up the pieces. David finally lifted his head from his hands. Sarah, I need to know everything. All of it. No more partial truths or me dismissing your concerns. His voice was hollow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. How long have you been documenting this? Since Emma's second birthday, I admitted, my phone feeling heavy in my hands. After the bed incident, I started taking screenshots of texts that felt wrong. But I really started paying attention in March when she told you I was getting fat. Jesus, David whispered. March was when you stopped eating dinner with us some nights. You said you weren't hungry, but I thought, he looked at his mother, who was gripping the back of a chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I thought you were just stressed about Emma starting preschool. I was stressed about Linda volunteering to chaperone Emma's field trips so she could tell the other mothers that I was too anxious to handle school events myself, I said, scrolling to another screenshot. March 28th, Linda to Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher. Sarah's been struggling with social anxiety since Emma was born. I've offered to take over some of the parental responsibilities to give her time to focus on her mental health. Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't at the party, but Jennifer gasped. That's why Emma's teacher asked me if you were doing okay when I picked Emma up that one time. She said Grandma Linda had mentioned you were having a difficult time adjusting to preschool separation. I never had separation anxiety, I said flatly. I was excited for Emma to start school. But Linda convinced everyone I was falling apart so she could position herself as the stable grandmother stepping in to help. Uncle Tom pulled out his own phone, frowning at the screen. Linda, did you call my wife 3 weeks ago about Thanksgiving plans? Linda's face went gray. Tom, I can explain. Because Margaret just texted me back. She says you called on November 28th and told her that Sarah was overwhelmed by hosting duties and suggested we have Thanksgiving at your house instead this year. But Sarah had already invited us, and we were looking forward to seeing their new dining room set. My stomach dropped. You what? We never got to host our first Thanksgiving, David said slowly, pieces clicking into place. The Tuesday before, you told me your mom had called and offered to take over because you seemed stressed about cooking for 12 people. I bought a 20-pound turkey, I whispered, remembering how excited I'd been to finally host a holiday in our own home. I spent weeks planning the menu and rearranging furniture. When you said your mom was taking over, I thought you'd asked her to because you didn't think I could handle it. Linda's voice came out barely audible. Sarah, you have to understand, 12 people is a lot for someone who's never hosted before, and I just thought. You thought you'd sabotage my first chance to be the hostess so you could swoop in and save the day, I finished, my voice getting stronger with anger. Then you spent the entire dinner telling everyone how grateful you were that you could help Sarah avoid a stressful situation. Robert stood up abruptly, his beer bottle forgotten on the side table. 47 years, he said again, looking at Linda like he'd never seen her before. Linda, how many other times have you manipulated situations behind our backs? Dad's right, David said, his voice gaining strength. How many conversations have you had with my wife's family? Her friends? Emma's teachers? Our neighbors? Linda looked around the room desperately, searching for an ally, but every face reflected the same mixture of shock and disappointment. I was trying to build bridges, she said weakly. Sarah's so private, she never tells people when she's struggling, so I thought. You thought you'd create struggles that didn't exist so you could solve them, Jennifer interrupted, her lawyer instincts kicking in. Linda, this isn't just boundary crossing. Some of what you've done could be considered harassment or stalking. The word stalking hit the room like a physical blow. David's cousin Mark, who'd been quietly scrolling through his phone, suddenly looked up with alarm. Aunt Linda, Mom wants to know why you asked her for Sarah's sister's phone number last month. My blood turned to ice. You called my sister? Linda's silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. What did you tell Jenny? My voice cracked on my sister's name. Jenny, who'd been my rock through every difficult moment of my life until recently, when she'd started making comments about me seeming distant and different since getting married. Linda stammered, but Mark was already dialing his phone. Mom? Yeah, it's Mark. I need you to tell me exactly what Aunt Linda said when she called about Sarah's sister. He put the phone on speaker, and his mother's voice filled the room. Oh, hi everyone. Linda called me around November 15th, I think. She was worried because Sarah's sister had mentioned that Sarah seemed withdrawn lately, and Linda wanted to coordinate with the family to make sure Sarah got the support she needed. The room spun around me. Jenny never said I seemed withdrawn. Mark's mother continued through the speakerphone. Linda suggested that maybe Sarah's family should encourage her to see someone professionally, because David was worried but didn't want to push too hard. She gave me some names of therapists who specialize in postpartum issues. Postpartum issues? David's voice cracked. Emma's 4 years old. And I never spoke to Jenny about seeming withdrawn, I said, my hands shaking as the full scope of Linda's manipulation became clear. But Jenny started asking me weird questions after that. About whether I was happy in my marriage, whether David was supportive, whether I missed my old life before kids. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Linda hadn't just been poisoning David's family against me, she'd been working on my family too, creating concern and doubt where none had existed before. Robert's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Linda, you've been running a systematic campaign to isolate Sarah from everyone who might support her. And looking around the room at the faces staring back at Linda with growing horror, I realized he was absolutely right. The weight of Robert's words, systematic campaign to isolate Sarah, hung in the air like smoke. I could see the exact moment it clicked for David, his face going from confused to horrified to something that looked like grief. The gym membership, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Last Valentine's Day, I almost bought you that yoga package you'd mentioned wanting. But Mom said, he turned to look at Linda, who had gone completely white. She said you told her you were too embarrassed about your body to work out in public. My heart clenched. I remembered that conversation with David about the yoga studio downtown, how excited I'd been about finally doing something for myself. When Valentine's Day came and went with just dinner and flowers, I'd assumed he'd forgotten or thought it wasn't important. I never said that, I whispered. I was excited about those classes. I'd even looked up the schedule and figured out childcare. Jennifer pulled out her own phone, her face grim. Sarah, I'm so sorry, but I need to ask you something. Did you tell Aunt Linda that you didn't want to come to my wedding shower in September? The question hit me like a physical blow. What? Jennifer, I never got invited to your wedding shower. But Linda said, Jennifer's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. She called me 3 weeks before the shower and said you'd mentioned to her that bridal events made you uncomfortable because of your own small wedding. She suggested maybe I shouldn't put you in an awkward position by inviting you. David made a sound like he'd been punched. Sarah cried for 2 days when she found out about that shower on Facebook. She thought you didn't consider her close enough family to invite. I planned my whole shower around the idea that you wouldn't be there because Linda said you wouldn't want to come, Jennifer said, tears starting to flow again. I picked a date when you had that doctor's appointment because Linda said you'd mentioned using it as an excuse to avoid the event. What doctor's appointment? I asked, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew. Your annual physical, David said slowly. The one you'd scheduled for September 23rd. But that was just a routine checkup. Linda had somehow known about my doctor's appointment and used it to convince Jennifer I was looking for excuses to avoid family events. The manipulation was so intricate, so carefully planned, that it took my breath away. Mrs. Patterson, Linda's neighbor who'd been sitting silently through most of this, suddenly cleared her throat. Linda, honey, I think I need to tell everyone about our conversation last week. Linda actually took a step backward. Eleanor, please don't. You asked me to keep an eye on Sarah when she's in the yard with Emma, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice shaking slightly. You said you were worried about her supervision skills and that David had asked you to arrange some informal monitoring. The room erupted again. David shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled over. I never asked for anything like that. Sarah is an incredible mother. You told Mrs. Patterson to spy on my wife? Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. Linda, what exactly were you hoping to document? Mrs. Patterson looked miserable. She said Sarah sometimes seemed distracted when Emma was playing outside, and that maybe I should just make note of times when Emma was, unsupervised isn't the right word, but when Sarah was on her phone or not directly watching. I take pictures of Emma playing, I said, my voice hollow with disbelief. When I'm on my phone in the backyard, I'm taking pictures and videos to send to David at work and my parents in Colorado. The grandfather clock chimed 10:30, and in the relative quiet that followed, Uncle Tom's wife Margaret spoke up from her corner chair. How many of us has she done this to? Her voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying anger. How many family relationships has Linda interfered with over the years? The question hung in the air, and I watched as family members started exchanging glances, not confused anymore, but knowing. Like they were all suddenly remembering conversations and incidents that hadn't made sense at the time. David's cousin Karen, who'd driven up from Sacramento for the party, slowly raised her hand. Linda called me in August about my divorce proceedings. She said David was worried about me but didn't want to overstep, and she asked if there was anything the family could do to help me reconcile with Brad. Karen, I never said anything about your divorce to my mother, David said, his voice flat with exhaustion. And after what Brad put you through, why would anyone want you to reconcile? That's exactly what I thought, Karen said, her voice getting stronger. But Linda spent 40 minutes on the phone telling me how important marriage commitment was to the family, and how she'd heard Brad was going to counseling and really trying to change. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. Linda, did you call Brad directly? The silence that followed was answer enough, but Karen's face had gone white. You contacted my abusive ex-husband behind my back? I thought if someone could mediate, Linda started, but Karen cut her off. Brad started showing up at Emma's soccer games in September, Karen said, turning to look at me. Games where you and Emma were also there. He kept asking about you, actually. About whether David's marriage was as solid as it looked, whether you seemed happy. My skin crawled. Linda, did you give Karen's ex-husband information about my family? But I already knew the answer from the way Linda's face had crumpled completely, the last of her defenses finally giving way. David's voice when he spoke was barely recognizable, low and hollow like something had broken inside him. Mom, did you give Brad information about my wife? Linda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and in that silence, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Karen's abusive ex-husband had been asking about me at Emma's soccer games. Games that Linda attended religiously, sitting in her folding chair with the cup holder, always positioning herself close enough to hear conversations between the other parents. Answer me, David said, his voice getting stronger. Did you talk to Brad about Sarah? I thought, Linda's voice cracked. Karen seemed so lonely, and Brad said he was in therapy, and I thought if I could just help them work things out. That's not what I asked you, David interrupted, and I'd never heard him speak to his mother like that before. Did you give Brad information about my wife and daughter? Mrs. Patterson suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Linda, that man who came by your house 3 weeks ago asking about your neighbors, was that Brad? The room went dead silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. What man? Robert demanded, his face flushing red. A younger man, maybe 35, brown hair, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking. He was parked in Linda's driveway for about an hour on a Wednesday afternoon. When I asked Linda about it later, she said it was someone asking about the neighborhood for a friend who might be moving to the area. Karen stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the hardwood. Brad is 34 with brown hair. Linda, did you let my ex-husband sit in your driveway and watch Sarah's house? I felt the world tilt sideways. Our house was directly across the street from Linda's. From her driveway, you could see our entire front yard, our mailbox, the times we came and went. I need to call the police, Jennifer said, already dialing her phone. Wait, David said, but his voice was shaking now. Mom, I need you to tell me exactly what you told Brad about Sarah and Emma. Right now. Linda looked around the room like a trapped animal, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. I didn't mean for anything bad to happen. I just thought, he seemed so sincere about wanting to make things right with Karen, and he asked about what stable marriages looked like. You used my family as an example for Karen's abusive ex-husband? I asked, my voice barely audible. You told him about our routines? Our schedules? I might have mentioned that Emma goes to Sunshine Preschool, Linda whispered. And that Sarah takes her to soccer practice at Riverside Park on Saturdays. The room exploded into chaos, but all I could hear was the rushing sound of blood in my ears. Linda had given a man with a documented history of stalking and domestic violence the location of my 4-year-old daughter's school and her weekly activities. Karen was screaming at Linda, Jennifer was talking rapidly to a 911 dispatcher, and David was staring at his mother like she'd physically assaulted him. But all I could think about was last Saturday at soccer practice, when a man I didn't recognize had been sitting in a car at the edge of the parking lot, watching the field. Emma had run over to me during halftime, tugging on my sleeve. Mommy, that man in the blue car keeps looking at me. Do you know him? I'd glanced over, but the car had been too far away to see the driver clearly. When I looked again 10 minutes later, he was gone. I'd forgotten about it completely until this moment. David, I said quietly, cutting through the chaos in the room. I think Brad was at Emma's soccer game last Saturday. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. David's face had gone completely white, and I could see his hands trembling as he processed what I just said. Sarah, Jennifer said carefully, still holding her phone with 911 on the line, can you describe the car you saw? My mind raced back to Saturday afternoon, Emma's ponytail bouncing as she ran across the field in her bright yellow uniform. Dark blue sedan, maybe a Honda or Toyota. Older model. The man had brown hair and was wearing sunglasses, but he wasn't watching the game. He was watching the sidelines where the parents were sitting. Karen made a choking sound. Brad drives a blue 2018 Civic. Oh my God, Margaret whispered from her corner chair. Linda, what have you done? But Linda wasn't responding anymore. She'd sunk into one of her dining room chairs, her perfectly applied makeup smeared with tears, staring at nothing. The woman who'd spent 3 years orchestrating elaborate manipulations had finally run out of words. Robert stepped closer to his wife, his voice deadly quiet. Linda Elizabeth Morrison, you look at me right now and tell me exactly what information you gave that man about our granddaughter. The use of Linda's full name seemed to snap her back to the present. She looked up at Robert with red-rimmed eyes. I told him Emma plays soccer at Riverside Park on Saturdays at 10 a.m. I mentioned that Sarah usually brings snacks for the team and stays for the full practice. Her voice was barely audible. He asked if Emma ever went anywhere alone with Sarah, without David. My stomach dropped to my feet. Why would he ask that? He said he was trying to understand family dynamics for his therapy, Linda whispered. He wanted to know if modern marriages really work the way they looked from the outside, or if women like Sarah were just better at hiding problems. David exploded. Are you completely insane? You gave a domestic abuser a profile of my wife's weekly routine with our daughter. I didn't know he was, Linda started, but Karen cut her off. Yes, you did know. Karen's voice was shaking with fury. I told you exactly why I divorced Brad at Jennifer's engagement party last year. I told you about the restraining order, about him following me to work, about the threatening voicemails. Uncle Tom pulled out his own phone. I'm calling David's house right now to make sure everything's secure there. Emma's at my sister's house for the night, I said quickly, then realized what that meant. Oh God, Linda, do you know where my sister lives? Linda's fresh wave of tears was answer enough. November 20th, I said, scrolling frantically through my phone for the screenshots I'd organized. Linda texted David asking if Emma was excited about her sleepover adventure and mentioned that Jenny's apartment complex looked very safe from the photos on Facebook. David grabbed my phone and stared at the screenshot. Mom, you researched Sarah's sister's address? I was just trying to stay involved in Emma's life. Linda's voice pitched higher with desperation. Sarah never tells me anything about Emma's activities or who she spends time with. Because you use every piece of information as ammunition, I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. You took the innocent detail that Emma loves sleepovers with Aunt Jenny and somehow turned it into reconnaissance for a stalker. Jennifer finished her call with 911 and looked up grimly. Police are on their way. Karen, they're going to want to speak with you about Brad's history and any current restraining orders. The restraining order expired in August, Karen admitted, her voice hollow. My lawyer said I could renew it, but Brad hadn't contacted me in over a year, so I thought maybe he'd finally moved on. Until Linda reached out to him in September about reconciliation, I said, the timeline clicking into place. Right around the time he started showing up at soccer games. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand tentatively. Should I mention to the police that Linda's been having more visitors lately? I noticed because she usually tells me when she's expecting company, but there've been several cars in her driveway this month that she didn't mention. The blood drained from Robert's face. Linda, who else have you been talking to about Sarah and Emma? But Linda just sat there crying, her 3-year campaign of manipulation finally collapsing under the weight of its own toxicity. Looking around the room at 23 faces staring at her with horror instead of admiration, I realized that Linda's reign of psychological terror hadn't just destroyed my peace of mind, it had potentially put my daughter in real, physical danger. And as sirens began to wail in the distance, getting closer to Linda's pristine house in her perfect neighborhood, I knew that whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the way things were before. The police arrived just as I was trying to process the full scope of what Linda had done. Two officers, Detective Martinez and Officer Chen, walked into Linda's pristine living room that now felt like a crime scene. 23 family members sat in stunned silence as Detective Martinez pulled out a notepad. "We understand there's been some concerning contact with a restraining order subject," Detective Martinez said, his eyes scanning the room. "Can someone walk me through what's happened here tonight?" Karen stepped forward first, her voice shaking but determined. "My ex-husband Brad Henley has a history of stalking and domestic violence. I divorced him 18 months ago, and he's been mostly out of contact since my restraining order expired in August. But 3 weeks ago, he started showing up at my daughter's soccer games asking questions about other families." "What kind of questions?" Officer Chen asked, pen poised. "About whether marriages that looked stable from the outside really were," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "He was specifically asking about me and my husband David. Karen's games are at the same park where my daughter plays, just different time slots." Detective Martinez looked between me and Linda, who was still slumped in her dining room chair. "Ma'am, I understand you've been in contact with Mr. Henley?" Linda's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I thought I was helping. Karen seemed so lonely after her divorce, and when Brad called me in September saying he was in therapy and wanted to make amends, I thought maybe. You gave him information about my family," I interrupted, pulling up my phone. "I have documentation of a 3-year pattern of harassment and manipulation, but tonight we discovered that Linda provided Brad Henley with my daughter's school name, our address, and our weekly schedule." Officer Chen looked up sharply. "Your 4-year-old's schedule?" David stepped closer to me, his jaw clenched. "My mother told him that Emma attends Sunshine Preschool and plays soccer at Riverside Park on Saturdays at 10 a.m. She also mentioned that Sarah usually takes Emma places alone, without me." "Jesus Christ, Linda," Robert muttered from across the room. Detective Martinez turned to me. "Have you noticed any unusual activity around your home or your daughter's activities?" "Last Saturday there was a man in a blue Honda Civic watching soccer practice from the parking lot," I said, my stomach churning as I remembered Emma pointing him out. My daughter noticed him staring at her specifically. When I looked over, he was too far away to identify, but the car matches Karen's description of Brad's vehicle. Karen nodded grimly. "Blue 2018 Civic, license plate 7G4M892. Officer Chen was writing rapidly. "Any other incidents you can recall?" Mrs. Patterson raised her hand hesitantly. "Detective, I live next door to Linda. 3 weeks ago, there was a man matching that description parked in her driveway for over an hour. Linda told me he was asking about the neighborhood for a friend looking to move here, but from that driveway, you can see directly into Sarah's front yard and monitor when the family comes and goes." I felt David tense beside me. "He was conducting surveillance on our house from my mother's property?" "It appears that way," Detective Martinez said, looking at Linda with obvious disgust. "Ma'am, did you know Mr. Henley was using your home to watch your son's family?" Linda finally looked up, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "I thought he was just curious about what healthy families look like for his therapy work. He said his counselor suggested he observe stable marriages to understand what he'd done wrong." "That's not how therapy works, Linda," Jennifer said sharply, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "That's how stalking works." Detective Martinez closed his notepad. "We need to locate Mr. Henley immediately and determine if he poses an active threat. Karen, I'll need you to come to the station to provide a full statement about his previous behavior patterns." "What about Emma?" David asked, his voice cracking slightly. "She's at my sister-in-law's house tonight, but Linda knows that address too." The detective looked at me seriously. "I'd recommend keeping your daughter somewhere Mr. Henley wouldn't think to look until we can bring him in for questioning." As if on cue, my phone rang. Jenny's name appeared on the screen, and my blood turned to ice. "Sarah?" Jenny's voice was tight with worry when I answered. "There's a man sitting in a car outside my apartment complex. He's been there for about 20 minutes, and Emma noticed him from the window. She said he looks like the man from her soccer game." The phone nearly slipped from my trembling hands. "Jenny, are you sure it's the same car?" "Emma's very specific about details, you know that." My sister's voice was tight with controlled panic. "She said it's the blue car with the scratched bumper like Daddy's old truck." "Sarah, what's going on? Should I call the police?" Detective Martinez was already gesturing for my phone. "Ma'am, this is Detective Martinez with the Riverside Police. We need you to stay away from windows and keep your doors locked. We're sending a unit to your location right now." I could hear Emma's voice in the background asking Jenny why everyone sounded scared. My 4-year-old daughter was trapped in an apartment with a stalker outside, and it was my mother-in-law's fault. "Emma can't know what's happening," I said to Detective Martinez after he handed back my phone. "She'll have nightmares for months." David was pacing behind me, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. My mother turned my family into targets for a violent criminal because she couldn't handle me being married." Linda finally spoke up, her voice barely audible. "Brad seemed so sincere. He said he'd been sober for 8 months and was doing anger management therapy. He showed me certificates from his programs." Karen laughed bitterly. "He had certificates last year too, Linda. Forged ones he printed at home. That's why the restraining order existed in the first place." Officer Chen's radio crackled to life. "Unit 47 to Detective Martinez. We've got eyes on a blue Honda Civic parked outside 1247 Maple Street, apartment complex. Male subject inside matching the description. My sister's apartment. The address Linda had researched on Facebook and somehow passed along to Brad. Is he approaching the building?" Detective Martinez responded. "Negative. Subject appears to be conducting surveillance. Vehicle has been stationary for approximately 30 minutes. Jennifer grabbed my arm. "Sarah, how did Linda even know Jenny's address?" "You're so careful about privacy." I scrolled through my screenshots, finding the conversation from last month. November 15th, Linda texted David asking if Emma was excited about her sleepover. She mentioned that Jenny's apartment complex looked very family-friendly from the photos she'd seen. David stared at the screenshot. "You researched Jenny's social media, Mom?" "I wanted to make sure Emma was staying somewhere safe," Linda whispered. "Jenny posted pictures of Emma playing in the courtyard playground. I was just being a concerned grandmother." "You were gathering intelligence," Robert said flatly. Linda, you've been running surveillance on our entire family. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat hesitantly. Detective, should I mention that Linda asked me last week about Sarah's usual grocery shopping day? She said she wanted to coordinate schedules so they wouldn't accidentally run into each other at the store. My blood ran cold. I shop at Riverside Market every Thursday morning while Emma's at preschool. Brad was asking about your routine activities, Karen said, pieces clicking together. He wanted to know when you'd be alone, without David or other family members around. Officer Chan's radio crackled again. Subject is exiting vehicle. Approaching apartment building. Detective Martinez grabbed his radio. All units respond to 1247 Maple Street immediately. Subject is potentially armed and has violated previous restraining order conditions. I could hear sirens starting up in the distance, but they seemed impossibly far away. Emma was in that building with a man who'd been studying our family's patterns for weeks, armed with information Linda had carefully provided. How long until backup arrives? David asked, his voice tight with panic. 3 minutes, Officer Chin replied, but we all knew that was 3 minutes too long. My phone buzzed with a text from Jenny, man just entered building. We're hiding in bedroom closet with Emma. She thinks we're playing hide and seek. Linda looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never meant for. Save it, I cut her off, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. My daughter is hiding in a closet because you handed her location to a stalker. The grandfather clock chimed 11 p.m., and all I could do was pray the police would reach my family before Brad did. Officer Chen's radio crackled with static before a voice came through. Unit 47, subject has entered the building through a propped emergency exit door. Resident reports hearing footsteps in the stairwell moving toward the 3rd floor. Jenny's apartment was on the 3rd floor. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold my phone when it buzzed again. Jenny had sent a photo from inside her bedroom closet, Emma curled up in her lap, both of them squeezed behind hanging clothes. Emma was smiling, completely unaware that this wasn't actually a game. 2 minutes out, Detective Martinez said into his radio, but his voice was tense. Units 23 and 31, cover all exits. Do not let subject leave the building. David was pacing behind the couch now, his face gray with panic. This is my fault. I should have listened to Sarah years ago. I should have protected them from. He stopped mid-sentence and turned to stare at Linda with an expression I'd never seen before. You planned this. What? Linda looked up from her chair, mascara still streaking down her cheeks. You've been feeding Brad information for months, David continued, his voice getting stronger and more accusatory. The soccer schedule, Emma's school, Sarah's shopping routine, Jenny's address. You didn't just answer his questions, you provided him with a complete surveillance package. Jennifer stepped closer, her lawyer instincts fully engaged. Linda, when exactly did Brad first contact you? Because I'm starting to think September wasn't the beginning of this. Linda's silence stretched on too long. Uncle Tom leaned forward in his chair. Linda, answer the question. July, she whispered finally. He first called in July asking about Karen, but then he seemed genuinely interested in understanding why some marriages work and others don't. My blood turned to ice. July? You've been talking to him for 5 months? And in July, Karen said slowly, that's when Brad started showing up at random places around town. The grocery store, Emma's preschool pickup line, the library during story time. She turned to look at me with horror. Sarah, he's been stalking your family since the summer. Mrs. Patterson gasped. The jogger. Linda, remember the jogger I mentioned in August? The man who'd been running past both our houses every morning around the same time? I thought it was strange because he'd slow down and look toward your house and Sarah's, but you said some people were just curious about the neighborhood. Brad doesn't jog, I said numbly, remembering the mornings I'd noticed someone in a gray hoodie passing by our house right around the time I took Emma to preschool. He was timing our schedule. Officer Chan's radio erupted again. Building manager reports subject knocked on apartment 3C asking about Jenny Morrison. Manager told him no one by that name lives there. Subject is now moving through hallway checking apartment numbers. Jenny's last name was Collins, not Morrison, but Brad was looking for Emma's Aunt Jenny in apartment 3C, exactly where they were hiding. How does he know it's apartment 3C? Detective Martinez demanded, grabbing his radio. I scrolled frantically through my screenshots, searching for any mention of Jenny's specific apartment number. Linda, did you tell Brad which apartment Jenny lives in? I might have mentioned that Jenny posted a photo of Emma playing in the courtyard and you could see her apartment number in the background of the picture, Linda admitted, her voice barely audible. David made a sound like he'd been physically struck. You gave him Emma's exact location. My phone buzzed with another text from Jenny, someone knocking on door asking for Jenny Morrison. We're staying hidden but Emma's getting scared. Officer Chen spoke into his radio, subject is at apartment 3C. Residents are inside and aware. Units ETA 1 minute. 1 minute felt like an eternity. Emma was 3 floors up with a stalker outside her door, and the only reason he'd found her was because my mother-in-law had spent 5 months providing him with detailed intelligence about my family's entire life. Linda looked around the room at 23 faces staring at her with undisguised horror and disgust. I thought I was protecting David, she whispered. I thought if Brad could see what a real marriage looked like. You thought you'd use my 4-year-old daughter as bait to prove some twisted point about your superiority, I interrupted, my voice cutting through her excuses. You endangered Emma to feed your own ego. The sirens were getting closer now, but they still seemed impossibly far away from where my daughter sat hiding in a closet, asking her aunt why the game wasn't fun anymore. The radio crackled again, units in position. Subject is now attempting to force entry into apartment 3C. Residents, if you can hear this, stay where you are. My phone lit up with an incoming call from Jenny. I answered immediately, putting it on speaker so Detective Martinez could hear. Sarah? Jenny's voice was barely a whisper. Emma's asking why the man outside keeps saying her name. She's getting really scared and I don't know how to. The line went dead. Jenny? Jenny? I screamed into the phone, but there was only silence. David grabbed Detective Martinez's radio. My daughter is in that apartment. What's happening up there? Unit 47, status report, Detective Martinez demanded. Static filled the room before a voice responded, subject has breached the apartment door. We're moving in now. The next 60 seconds stretched into an eternity. Robert had his arm around Linda, who was sobbing uncontrollably. Jennifer was pacing by the windows. Mrs. Patterson kept muttering prayers under her breath. And I stood frozen in the middle of Linda's perfect living room, listening to radio chatter about my daughter's life hanging in the balance. Suspect in custody, Officer Chan's radio finally announced. 2 adults and 1 child found safe in bedroom closet. No injuries reported. I collapsed into the nearest chair as relief flooded through me. Emma was safe. Jenny was safe. But the aftershocks of what had almost happened were just beginning to hit. David turned to face his mother, and when he spoke, his voice was completely flat. 5 months, Mom. You spent 5 months feeding information to a stalker because you were so threatened by my marriage that you put my daughter's life at risk. Linda looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. David, sweetheart, I never meant. Stop. David held up his hand. Just stop. I don't want to hear about your intentions anymore. I want to know exactly what else you told Brad that we haven't figured out yet. Detective Martinez pulled out his notepad again. Ma'am, we're going to need a complete timeline of every conversation you had with Mr. Henley, every piece of information you provided, and any other individuals you may have discussed Mrs. Morrison's family with. Other individuals? Uncle Tom asked sharply. Linda's fresh wave of tears told us everything we needed to know. Who else, Linda? Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. Who else have you been talking to about Sarah and Emma? There was a woman who called last month, Linda whispered. She said she was doing a survey about neighborhood safety for the school district. She asked about local families with young children, their routines, security measures. Jennifer's face went white. Linda, the school district doesn't conduct those kinds of surveys. You gave information to another stranger? My phone buzzed with a text from Jenny, police bringing us to station for statements. Emma thinks the officers are here for a parade. She's fine but asking for Mommy. I showed the text to David, who immediately stood up. We're going to the station now. Detective Martinez nodded. We'll need statements from both of you anyway. But Mrs. Morrison, he turned to Linda, you're not going anywhere until we've documented every single person you've shared information with over the past 6 months. As David and I headed toward the door, Linda called out desperately, Sarah, please. I know I made mistakes, but I love Emma more than anything. I'd never intentionally put her in danger. I stopped at the threshold of her perfect house and turned back one last time. You spent 3 years systematically destroying my mental health, and tonight my daughter hid in a closet while a violent stalker tried to break down her door. Your love almost got her killed, Linda. And with that, David and I walked out into the night, leaving Linda's 65th birthday party in ruins behind us. The police station was a blur of fluorescent lights and coffee-stained desks, but all I could focus on was Emma's small hand in mine as we sat in Detective Martinez's office at 2:47 a.m. She'd finally fallen asleep curled up in David's lap, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just survived a stalking incident orchestrated by her own grandmother. Brad Henley is being held without bail, Detective Martinez said quietly, sliding a thick folder across his desk. We found detailed notes in his car, your family's schedule, Emma's school pickup times, even a hand-drawn map of your neighborhood with your house circled in red. David's jaw clenched as he looked at the evidence photos. All information my mother provided. The investigation is ongoing, but we've identified at least 3 other instances where Mrs. Morrison shared sensitive information with unknown callers claiming to be conducting surveys or research, the detective continued. We're treating this as a criminal conspiracy. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer, Linda's been arrested. Charges pending but likely criminal facilitation and child endangerment. Dad's beside himself. I showed the message to David, who just nodded grimly. Good. Detective Martinez leaned back in his chair. What's your plan moving forward? I assume you'll be seeking a restraining order. That's just the beginning, David said, his voice steady and determined in a way I'd never heard before. Sarah's been documenting 3 years of harassment and stalking behavior. Tonight proved that my mother poses a legitimate threat to my family's safety. Over the next 6 weeks, everything changed. The restraining order was approved within 72 hours. Linda was prohibited from contacting us directly, coming within 500 feet of our home, Emma's school, or any location where we regularly spent time. The judge called her behavior a systematic campaign of harassment designed to isolate and endanger the victims. David filed for divorce from his family, if such a thing existed. He changed our locks, installed a security system, and blocked Linda's number from both our phones. When she tried to send Emma birthday presents through Mrs. Patterson, David returned them unopened with a letter from our attorney. The extended family divided cleanly. Jennifer, Uncle Tom, Margaret, and most of David's cousins cut Linda off completely once they understood the full scope of her manipulation. Robert filed for legal separation after 47 years of marriage. I can't trust someone who endangered our granddaughter, he told David during one of their weekly coffee meetings, a new tradition that replaced the mandatory Sunday dinners at Linda's house. Karen's case against Brad was strengthened by the evidence of Linda's involvement. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison for stalking and violating restraining order conditions. Karen sent us a card afterward, thank you for being brave enough to expose the truth. But the most important change was in our own home. David started therapy to process what he called a lifetime of manipulation I was too close to see. He apologized to me almost daily for the first month, until I finally told him that rebuilding trust required action, not just words. You chose us, I reminded him one evening as we watched Emma play in our backyard, our space, finally free from surveillance and interference. When it mattered most, you chose your wife and daughter over your mother. That's what I'll remember. Emma adjusted remarkably well, though she occasionally asked why Grandma Linda stopped coming to soccer games. We told her that Grandma had made some poor choices and needed time to think about how to be a better person. At 4 years old, this satisfied her completely. 6 months later, Mrs. Patterson moved to Arizona to be closer to her own grandchildren. Before leaving, she stopped by with a plate of cookies and an apology. I should have questioned Linda's stories about you years ago, she said. Sometimes the truth is right in front of us, but we choose the comfortable lie instead. As I write this, it's been 8 months since Linda's birthday party. Emma is thriving in kindergarten, David has learned to trust his own instincts instead of defaulting to his mother's opinions, and I've started sleeping through the night again without jumping at every sound. Linda sent one letter through her attorney, a rambling 4-page explanation about her intentions and how much she missed Emma. Our lawyer returned it unopened with instructions that all future communication must go through legal channels. The truth is, I don't hate Linda anymore. I pity her. She destroyed a 47-year marriage, lost her relationship with her only son and granddaughter, and faces potential criminal charges, all because she couldn't accept that David's life had grown beyond her control. But I don't forgive her either. Forgiveness requires acknowledging that someone made a mistake. Linda made a calculated series of choices over 3 years that culminated in my 4-year-old daughter hiding in a closet while a stalker tried to break down her door. That wasn't a mistake. That was the inevitable consequence of turning love into ownership and family into warfare. Standing up to Linda didn't just free me from her psychological torture, it freed our entire family from a toxic dynamic that had poisoned relationships for decades. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to keep someone else's peace at the expense of your own safety. And sometimes, the only way to protect your family is to acknowledge that the greatest threat was sitting at your dinner table all along.